Welcome to The World Below, The War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the adventure, the intrigue and the magic of a land that lies beneath the celestial battle between gods and demons, a clash that has gone on since time immemorial. I'm your guide, your interlocutor and your host, Michael Pryor. Welcome everyone to episode 33 of the World Below the War in the Heavens podcast. This one is all about Queen Corin I of Annaquist, sometimes known as the Battle Queen. And here's a first for this podcast. We're going to need 2 episodes to cover the reign of Queen Corin, so let's launch straight away into our first 2-parter. The overview. Queen Corin I of Annaquist was thrust onto the throne, more or less, because of the unexpected and shocking death of her brother, King Daimon IV, in 461. She had 2 younger siblings, Sendir and Ascot, and her father, King Daimon III, and her mother were both deceased. She was only 19. While Corin and her siblings had attended Daimon's Council of Advisors from an early age, it hadn't really been with any intention of them ruling. It was more of a show of solidarity to demonstrate that the throne wasn't in dispute in any way, but simply being present during discussions both mundane and crucial must have stood her in good stead when the news came in mid-year 461 that her brother had been slain when the border patrol he'd been riding with was wiped out by a raider party in the northwest of Annaquist. A moment here about the language, as I'm going to be discussing the wave after wave of attacks on Annaquist by the peoples of the interior of the continent, I'd probably better nail down who we're talking about and what to call them. The vast interior of the world below the War in the Heavens was and is sparsely populated, and in the time of Daimon and Corin, it was barely explored or charted. It was populated, however, by various groups of people. Some of them were essentially refugees, the interior of the continent being seen as free from the constraints of the realms, the states, the jurisdictions of the world below the War in the Heavens, these mostly being close to the coast, with notable exceptions. Others were people who had simply chosen to live there, attracted by the wide open spaces, and had been there since time immemorial. How many people lived there? Untold numbers is the best response. Lots, a few, it's hard to tell. But in this latter part of the 5th century, something galvanised some groups from the inland and drove them to attack the more prosperous, fertile parts of the continent in a manner far beyond what had been the usual intermittent incursions. Dr. Tam Shud from the Overburden Institute in Wales has probed this development considerably. He suggests 2 possible reasons for the increase in forays from the inland. Firstly, some records indicate that a decade-long drought struck the interior in the 440s, with long-lasting effects on crop growing and agriculture in general across widespread parts of the inland. This has been backed up by dendrochronology, tree ring studies. Secondly, and more controversially, he posits that a number of like-minded expansionist leaders arose at around the same time, banded together and agreed on a series of strikes into the heart of Annaquist, mostly for the purposes of booty. He based this mostly on a song cycle that he insists originated around this time that tells of 3 mighty warlords who strike such a deal. The song cycles survived to modern times with many variations, not the least being the 3 names. So oral history or simply storytelling with no basis in fact, who's to tell? In any case, by the time Queen Corin took the throne, things were getting serious. And again, to the matter of nomenclature. At the times of Corin's accession, the term barbarian was in widespread use to describe these people riding out of the wilderness. The fact that they had sizable settlements, traded across the continent, and were renowned for scholars, particularly in the area of what we'd call the natural sciences, geology, biology. And so that makes barbarian an uncomfortable fit. Raiders is perhaps more useful, but I still feel that it's not quite right. It sounds as if these incursions were haphazard and that the forays at this time were half-hearted or spontaneous. I think inland people is perhaps the best term, with the proviso that it does tend to lump a number of very different folk together. I'll use it with reservation. Back to the overview. Queen Corin ruled for 11 years. Her entire reign was devoted to battling wave after wave of attacks from these inland people, and despite her reluctance to become involved in the military side of things, unlike Daimon IV, her brother, she girded herself, and by the end of her reign she was widely known and praised as the Battle Queen. Queen Corin died in the siege of Yemen in the year 472 and was survived by her only child, Iona, who was just months old. Reign highlights. This is pretty straightforward, really. The great matter of Corin's reign was the unprecedented assault on Anaquist by the inland people, and in particular 4 legendary battles. The Battle of Stonlad, 462, the Battle of Lake Zash, 464, the famous Battle of Resk's Crossing, 469, and the tragic Siege of Yemen, 472. Each one of these marked a crucial moment in what truly should be called a war, rather than a series of raids, as many characterise them. In between these famous massed battles, we mustn't forget that during Queen Corin's reign, Anaquist was subject to almost continuous incursions from the northwest, to the point where the major border town of Yemen was lost and occupied in 468, leading to the disastrous siege of Yemen and the death of the Queen. Upon her unexpected accession to the throne, Queen Corin had little time to adjust to a role that had quickly become that of a military leader. Incursions had been increasing during Daimon's reign, but whether upon the news of his death spreading it inspired leaders among the inland people to see an opportunity to press their aims, well, that could be the case. The years before King Daimon IV's reign had been notably peaceful. While Anaquist wasn't unprepared to mobilise, it was certainly unaccustomed to the ferocity and cunning with which the inland people began to march. Corin saw that more was needed than enabling and encouraging her military commanders to spring into action. Anaquist needed a true wartime leader, and so, despite any reluctance she might have had, she positioned herself not just as queen, but as leader of the Anaquistian army and its supreme commander. This meant riding at the head of troops, and she did this in specially constructed armour from Gesh. Now, loyal listeners might remember that I devoted a fair bit of Season 3, Episode 3 to the weapon makers of Gesh, the small, fiercely guarded mountainous realm not far from the northern borders of Anaquist, somewhat sandwiched between Anaquist and Arinthia, but tucked high in the mountains. Gesh's fame and riches came from its extraordinarily crafted weapons and armour, which were greatly sought after by all those of a military turn of mind, right across the world below the war in the heavens. Anaquist and Gesh had long had good trading relations, with Anaquist a major customer for Geshian work, but all commerce between the two realms ceased in the year 384, when King Zalman the Vicious executed the chief Gessian trade representative over a slight, and Gesh withdrew all contact with Anaquist. Even more significantly, in autumn 395, Gesh was conquered and annexed by the army of Queen Keska, the last of the monarchs of the Anaquistian nightmare years. The bloodshed and oppression needed to achieve this virtually put an end to the Geshian arms industry. When full-scale war with the inland people was looming, Corin saw what was ahead. She also saw that while the Anaquistian army was well provisioned and well led, the threat of a combined force from the inland was significant. She wanted an advantage, and so she made a personal trip to Gesh, where she granted it independence again. Within weeks, the master craftspeople who had fled Gesh began to return. The forges, foundries and armouries were reopened, and once again Geshian industry began to thrive. The secretive, almost monastic Geshian hierarchy was so impressed with Corin's charity, honesty, and her far-sightedness that a steady stream of the best arms and armour made its way from the mountains to Anaquist. In fact, so grateful were the Geshians with Corin that they made her special personalised armour. Unlike Queen Keska's dread black armour, which had her standing apart from everyone else on the battlefield, Corin's armour was ostensibly much the same as those of her commanders. The more important difference was that the weapon makers of Gesh had used magical means to sandwich a layer of the finest heavenly scales between two layers of supreme Geshian steel. This made her armour almost impervious to both point and edge. Only a scaled weapon of extreme puissance could hope to inflict any damage. Corin's foresight in re-establishing the Geshians as Anaquist's major supplier of arms and armour was crucial in what was to come. A sort of exchange program was also instituted where master Geshian weapon makers travelled from their land to Anaquist and helped improve the local industry. Anaquistian weapon makers never reached the heights of quality that the Geshians did, of course, but no one ever did. The almost mystical skill of the Geshian weapon makers was peerless, but their advice and mentorship was priceless. As I've already mentioned, skirmishes and raiding parties increased their depredations after King Daimon's death, almost becoming a constant problem through 461 and graduating into a full-blown crisis in early 462. As well as laying waste to towns and settlements on the border, bands of inland people began to intercept trade caravans from the west, which caused considerable disruption to the economy of Anaquist and other realms. Autumn 462 saw an unprecedented development. Hitherto, the forces of the inland people consisted of formidable archery and cavalry. Being such a disparate lot, some were more disciplined and better equipped than others, but at this time the inland waterways began to see the advent of inland people warcraft. The major inland waterways of the Frejanovska, Denban, Inman and Partial rivers experienced a flotilla of barges that began to pillage riverside towns and settlements. They were rumoured to be skippered and crewed, at least initially, by mercenaries from Jalox, the Jaloxians being consummate sailors and always happy to hire themselves out. This was a huge blind spot for the Anaquistian military command. It had long been thought, or assumed really, that since the interior of the continent was mostly harsh and dry, that the people who lived there had no need of nautical skills. Now attacks were coming not just from the land but from the water, and the inland people made great advances. The major fortress town of Yemen in the far northwest of Anaquist was an important strategic point in the area, and the only bridging for hundreds of miles in either direction over the big rivers. The bridges were somewhat of an oddity, as Yemen was situated at the confluence of the Inman and Partial rivers, so actually a pair of bridges had to be constructed, and they were joined by a well-made and well-used road, so a traveller could cross from east to west over the Partial, then north to south over the Inman to get to Yemen. A significant Anaquistian force had been stationed at Yemen on this frontier for centuries, and situated as it was near the confluence of the Inman and Partial rivers, the port there was a major trading centre, with the Inman extending to the west and south, and the Partial flowing for hundreds of miles from the north. Yemen had rarely come under attack in the past, as its fortifications and its garrisons were well maintained. A sizable town had grown up around the military installation. Commanders were given the task of regularly sallying forth to probe for inland people developments, but in 462 Yemen itself began to come under regular attack, both from the land and from the river. So serious had the situation become that in winter 462 the local traders sent a delegation to the capital and begged Queen Corin for assistance. The military commander in Yemen, Lucullus Dymek, supported this plea, writing to the army command asking for more troops and, for the first time in Yemen's military history, shipwrights and experienced captains from the Anaquistian navy. Queen Corin immediately approved both requests, but before either could have much impact, a major assault on Yemen, from what could only be called an army with land and river attacks coordinated, occurred. These barges were, at least at first, clumsy and unwieldy craft, but what they did was to allow astute inland people commanders to organise larger forces than ever before to cross the natural barriers of the Parshel and Inman rivers by using these barges to construct pontoon bridges. Later, they were also used as attack craft full of archers and as transport craft to deliver masses of troops. It's not too much to say that these simple watercraft took the conflict between the inland people and the Anaquistians to a new level. The Battle of Stonlad, 462. The Battle of Stonlad was the first major confrontation between these now somewhat united forces of the inland people and the Anaquistians under Queen Corin. Since the middle of Diamond IV's reign, pairs of scouts had crossed the Yemen Bridge and spent weeks, sometimes months, in the wilderness, far in advance of the regular companies that patrolled the other side of the rivers, alert for any incursions from the inland people. These scouts were instrumental in summoning Anaquistian soldiers from Yemen to try to intercept inland forces, and often this was successful. Since time immemorial, small parties were able to avoid the scouts and patrols by managing the dangerous river crossings by swimming their horses, but this necessarily kept their numbers small. In late winter 462, however, a pair of scouts far to the north and west of Yemen came across signs that a massing of inland people forces was taking place in numbers never seen before. One of the scouts, both of whose names are unknown, opted to stay to investigate more while the other rode furiously to find a patrol and report. After 2 futile days, and certain of the importance of her information, she gave up and rode directly for Yemen itself, arriving a week later. In war, the old Anaquistian saying goes, good fortune is worth 1,000 plans. And as luck would have it, the exhausted scout and her mount arrived in Yemen a day after Queen Corin herself had arrived at the head of a substantial reinforcing of the Yemen garrison, a brigade of somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 troops, mixed infantry, archery and cavalry, plus support. All troops, from the brigadiers down to the foot soldiers, had Geshian arms and armour. Yemen had rejoiced at the Queen's approach, and even more when she called a halt at the city gates and unfurled what became known as her battle standard, starting a tradition that endured whenever any Anaquistian monarch marched into war at the head of their army. Corin's standard was simple but effective, a white background bearing a golden trumpet in the middle, a symbol of the rallying that Corin wanted to achieve. Sadly, the standard itself was lost in the siege of Yemen in 472 and never recovered. Corin, her troops and her standard certainly rallied the folk of Yemen. When the scout arrived with her news of a massing of the inland people, the clamour was to take the battle to them. Corin, however, was no military hothead, and after interviewing the scout herself and impressed with the seriousness of the situation, she conferred with the commanders of both the Yemen garrison and the brigade she brought with her. Having done so, she acted swiftly. Within days, a combined force, the garrison and new troops, some 5,000 in all, left Yemen, crossed the bridge just downstream of the confluence, and marched to battle. Corin's forces found the inland people army just outside what had been the village of Stonlad, an agricultural outpost before it had been devastated by repeated raids by inland people, and finally falling into ruin. Now, I want to emphasise here that this engagement was no wild, undisciplined barbarians meeting hard-bitten professional Anaquistians. That's the standard portrayal of this war against the inland people, but it's been roundly debunked by recent scholars such as Pete Duell and Sergei Chegny, who have argued cogently that the forces of the inland people by this time were well equipped, well organised and well drilled. No madly rushing about issuing individual challenges, the inland people armies of this time manoeuvred well and maintained discipline. The Anaquistian army, of course, had always been highly regimented and commanded, But on meeting this large inland people host, some 7,000 to 8,000 strong, it was almost as if they were against an entirely new foe. The inland people cavalry had been absent from the engagement, perhaps making the Anaquistians overconfident. But just as the Anaquistian infantry pushed through the front lines of the inland people, the cavalry returned from a foraging expedition, saw the state of affairs, and swept around the left wing and drove into the flank of the Anaquistian infantry. The Anaquistian infantry, having already met more resistance than expected, faltered, and it was on the verge of collapsing into a rout when Queen Corin herself, flying her new battle standard, led her reserve cavalry to crash into the rear of the inland folk horse soldiers. Corin's reserve was some of her best heavy cavalry, and the inland folk, having been on a foraging expedition, were much lighter. Queen Corin, with her personal guard of some of the most formidable fighters, ploughed into the inland folk, routing their cavalry and wreaking much havoc on the inland folk infantry, who by this time had begun flinging weapons and shields aside and were fleeing. The casualties of the inland folk were almost entire. The Anaquistians were triumphant, and then and there hailed Queen Corin as the Battle Queen. Displaying her battle standard, she marched back to Yemen, where wild celebrations erupted. It was noted, however, how solemn the Queen was, displaying none of the jubilation of her troops and commanders. Perhaps, far-sighted as she proved to be, she was seeing that this triumph was far from the end of troubles with the inland people. The Battle of Lake Zash, 464. A short period of peace followed the Battle of Stonlad, but it was as Corin feared. The inland people hadn't retreated, broken and dispirited. They used the time to regroup. Another slight aside. It's assumed that at this time the disparate groups or clans or factions of the inland people must have had canny leaders who saw the value in uniting forces. But they must also have been shrewd tacticians, as their deployment in these battles and others showed intelligent disposition of troops, careful attention to supply lines, and excellent use of available terrain. The Anaquistians, with all their military experience and theory, were facing a formidable foe, but no names of these inland people leaders has survived. They remain shadowy figures, and haven't had the attention they deserve, except in Qualia Emmett's historical novel, Three Phantoms Who Led, 1933. And let's just say that this work is much like Qualia Emmett's other historical novels, long on romance and excitement, short on actual research. Anyway, back to the Battle of Lake Zash. There's a 2-year gap between the Battle of Stonlad and the Battle of Lake Zash, but don't get the idea that all was well and good. While no large-scale incursions came out of the inland, Anaquist was subject to almost constant raids from the north and west. Sources from the time note the desperate nature of these raiding parties, varying greatly in their weapons, clothing and tactics. Doomsayers gave full voice to the feeling that end times were near because the inland people were finally uniting and would soon overrun the continent. And so it was in late summer 462 that Queen Corin, against her better judgment, took the advice of her senior commanders and ordered the establishment of a new forward base across the Inman River. This was meant to be a show of force and commitment. Senior generals were convinced that this would daunt the inland people, overawing them with a display of Anaquistian military and engineering might. A large garrison, good fortifications, and a well-sealed road linking this forward base to Yemen, a day's ride away, all constructed speedily by the best Anaquistian military engineers, would demonstrate the futility of trying to best Anaquist. Funds were dispersed, orders given, and the plan swung into action. Within days, engineers were working on the road while others forged ahead with a sufficiently large protective force to survey the proposed area for the fortified garrison. a reasonably well-watered area on the western shore of Lake Zash, a shallow freshwater lake that ultimately draws its water from the Parshell River, some 100 miles away to the east and north. With typical Anarchistian precision, walls, streets and buildings were laid out by the engineers under the watchful gaze of the protective force, who were amused rather than alarmed when scouts from the inland people appeared on the low ridges to the west, and remained there for some time observing the works. This went on for a few weeks, this pattern of appearance and observation, so much so that it may have been taken for granted. Or perhaps the protective force had bought into the notion of Anarchistian supremacy. Regardless, the foundation works for the walls had barely begun when a full-scale attack was launched by the inland people, preceded by a substantial cavalry charge, hoping to trap the Anarchistians with their backs to the lake, with nowhere to retreat to. This may have been the plan, but the Anarchistians were seasoned campaigners and snapped into formation, presenting a formidable pike wall, protecting engineers and allowing archers to wreak havoc on the inland people horse troops, who withdrew, and then the legendary Demon Fire barrage began. Demon Fire. The mysterious Demon Fire, the subject of 1,000 stories and 100,000 nightmares. This much-feared weapon was faced for the first time in this Battle of Lake Zash and became the reason for much of the success of the inland people in subsequent battles. Exactly what it was, though, remains a mystery. Primary sources from the time speak about its horrible effects, its shattering of morale, and the panic it created even in prospect. More strange, perhaps, is that after the end of these wars with the inland people, in the reign of Queen Zestia, 497-507, Demon Fire was never heard of again. What we can say is that Demon Fire was the equivalent of both chemical warfare and extreme artillery barrage. The most reliable reports suggest that it was a hideous combination of demon scales gathered from heaven falls in the inland and launched from catapults. When it landed, it had a variety of different effects, apart from the almost standard unquenchable fire that stuck to bodies and equipment and couldn't be put out with water. The unpredictability of the Demon Fire canisters was part of what made them so feared. They screamed as they flew through the air. Some, when they landed, mangled and twisted bodies for some distance, as if a malignant and high-velocity wind had been unleashed. Some simply made people disappear, with air rushing in to fill the gap with an ear-splitting crack. Melting flesh, nightmare hallucinations, the appearance of savage and unknown monsters were other effects reported. The actual numbers of Demon Fire shells were small, but their terrifying effect, combined with more standard weaponry, meant that the protective force and the engineers broke and panicked, running for Yemen. Naturally, this overjoyed the inland people cavalry who rode down the fleeing Anarchistians. Only a few escaped to tell the tale of what had happened. The Battle of Lake Zash was the first time that an Anarchistian force had been so roundly defeated, and the emergence of Demon Fire magic marked a dangerous new phase of the conflict had begun. A note, Demon Fire naturally is a development that attracts attention. Pages have been written postulating that the inland people must have been gathering heavenfall artefacts, treasure and scales for some time in order to investigate their uses, and to come up with something so spectacular. But little heed is given to the more prosaic but probably equally important development, and that was of highly portable catapults. Catapults of all sorts have been known and used for centuries as siege engines, large and unwieldy machines that were deadly but awkward. A revolutionary approach from the inland people was to invent a sort of small, highly mobile and manoeuvrable catapult that could be easily horse-drawn and, in any case, only needed 2 crew to operate it. In essence, these small catapults were like field artillery. In the early days of these battles with the Anarchistians, they were highly effective and very deadly. That's where we're going to leave the reign of Corin I for now. Next week, part 2 of this two-parter. This has been The World Below the War in the Heavens, a podcast exploring the history, culture and esoterica of the world below, a continent of magic and mystery with inhabitants who keep one eye on the sky at all times. I've been your host, Michael Pryor. If you'd like to find out more about me and my books, pop over to www.michaelpryor.com.au. Farewell.